Okay, so today we're going to be talking about imperialism. So, becoming a world power on the world stage for the United States. So, first we have Secretary of State under Lincoln and Johnson, William H. Seward. So, he focused on the French in Mexico. So, he invoked the Monroe Doctrine, warning the French to get out of Mexico when Napoleon III sent French troops to occupy Mexico during the Civil War. Then Alaska, Russia and Great Britain were both claiming Alaska. Congress then bought it for $7.2 million in 1867. Americans at the time saw no value in it, calling it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. We also have industrialization, which intensified foreign involvement because we wanted raw materials for manufacturing, we wanted markets for industrial and agricultural products as well. And there was this kind of focus on international Darwinism or survival of the fittest, where we now have races for military advantage, colonies, and spheres of influence. During this time, so imperialism, rewind, definition, is acquiring territory or gaining control over the political or economic life of other countries. During this time, we see France, Britain, Germany, Russia, Japan, and other nations taking over areas of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. The US was like, wait a minute, we have to keep up, or we risk becoming a second-class power. We also have missionaries during this time, where we have the Reverend Josiah Strong, who said that people of Anglo-Saxon stock were the fittest to survive, aka racial supremacy through religion. As for naval power, U.S. Navy Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that a strong navy was crucial to a country's ambitions of securing foreign markets and becoming a world power. By 1900, the U.S. had the third largest navy in the world. We also have newspaper and magazine editors during this time finding that they could increase their circulation by printing adventure stories about distant and exotic places, which increased public interest, and it stimulated demands for a larger U.S. role in world affairs. Now, remember, we still are the protector of Latin America thanks to the Monroe Doctrine. We see this kind of extended during this time period where James G. Blaine was Secretary of State, and he wanted to bring together representatives of various nations of the Western Hemisphere to create a permanent organization for international cooperation on trade and other issues. The Pan-American Union actually continues today as part of the Organization of American States. So it's this larger goal of hemispheric cooperation on both economic and political issues. Now in Venezuela, we have issues with British Guiana. President Cleveland and Secretary of State Richard Olney wanted Great Britain to arbitrate the dispute between Venezuela and Britain. The British first said the U.S. should mind its own business, but then the U.S. said, hey, Monroe Doctrine, and it became a turning point in Great Britain and U.S.'s relationship, leading to AKA Let's Be Besties. Now, the Spanish-American War, also known as SPAM. Causes included jingoism, which is an intense form of nationalism that calls for an aggressive foreign policy. We have a Cuban revolt, Yellow Press, Delaune letter, sinking of the Maine, McKinley's war message, the Teller Amendment, all this stuff happening at the same time. So the Cuban revolt, Cuban nationalists renewed their struggle to overthrow Spanish colonial rule in 1895. They wanted the Spanish withdrawal or get the U.S. as an ally. So Spain sent over a guy nicknamed the Butcher and over 100,000 troops to crush the revolt. They forced the civilians into armed camps, and thousands died from starvation and disease. Now, yellow journalism is sensationalist reporting that features bold and lurid headlines of crime, disaster, scandal. We can thank Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst newspapers for printing a lot of exaggerated and false accounts. This was fake news before we had the hashtag. Many Americans believed what they read, and they wanted Congress and the president to intervene for humanitarian purposes. The Delone letter was a letter written by the Spanish minister to the U.S. that was highly critical of President McKinley. Oh, guess what? It was leaked to the press, and a lot of people considered it an official Spanish insult against the U.S. Then, less than 1 week after the Delone letter, the USS Maine sunk. So it was anchored in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, and it suddenly exploded. It killed 260 Americans on board, and the yellow press accused Spain of blowing up the ship. In reality, based on science today, it probably was that the ammunitions inside just happened to ignite, blow up, and blew up the ship. But then in McKinley's war message, we now have a list of reasons we're getting involved. So he wanted to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries in Cuba. He wanted to protect the lives and property of U.S. citizens living in Cuba. He wanted to end the very serious injury to the commerce, trade, and business of our people, and end the constant menace to our peace arising from disorder in Cuba. Then Congress passed a joint resolution authorizing the war, known as the Teller Amendment. It basically declared that the U.S. had no intention of taking any political control of Cuba. We just wanted peace restored to the island. Then in the Philippines, also another Spanish territory, the first shots of the Spanish-American War were fired in Manila Bay. Theodore Roosevelt was McKinley's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He ordered a fleet commanded by Commodore George Dewey to the Philippines. They fired on Spanish ships in Manila Bay. They allied with the Filipino rebels, which led to the capture of Manila in August of 1898. And in Cuba, the most lethal enemy was disease. More than 5,000 Americans died from malaria, typhoid, dysentery, when less than 500 people died in battle. The Spanish were poorly led, often got defeated. Theodore Roosevelt led a regiment of volunteers known as the Rough Riders. They're mostly known for their cavalry charge up San Juan Hill. At Santiago Bay, the U.S. Navy defeated the Spanish fleet, and in August, the Spanish asked the U.S. for terms of peace. So it was a splendid little war, as quoted back then. As for Hawaii, American settlers aided in overthrowing the Hawaiian monarch because they wanted to have control of the economy in Hawaii. So McKinley used the Spanish-American War to convince Congress to annex the Hawaiian Islands in 1900. So nice of them. Now, the Treaty of Peace was signed in Paris in 1898, and it recognized Cuban independence. We got 2 Spanish islands, Puerto Rico and Guam, and we got Philippines in return for payment to Spain of $20 million. Congress and the public were really sharply divided about the Philippines. The Philippines were pretty mad that they couldn't have their own independence. So Emilio Aguinaldo led bands of guerrilla fighters in a war against U.S. control. It ultimately took 3 years and cost thousands of lives on both sides before the insurrection ended. Then, in regards to Cuba, the Platt Amendment required Cuba to agree, in order to get rid of U.S. troops, to never sign a treaty with a foreign power that impaired its independence, to permit the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's affairs in order to preserve its independence, and to allow the U.S. to maintain naval bases in Cuba, which is why we have Guantanamo Bay. Now for China, we have spheres of influence from Russia, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Germany. Secretary of State John Hay proposed the open door policy, which said all nations would have equal trading rights in China. Then came the Boxer Rebellion, in which we have a whole lot of xenophobia, hatred and fear of foreigners. Nationalism and xenophobia were on the rise in China. So a secret society of Chinese nationalists attacked foreign settlements and murdered dozens of Christian missionaries. So U.S. troops participated in an international force to crush this rebellion. Theodore Roosevelt's imperialistic policy was known as speak softly and carry a big stick, meaning you could sneak up on someone, bat them over the head with a big stick. As a result of the Spanish-American War, the new American empire stretched from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to the Philippines in the Pacific. As a strategic necessity for holding on to those far-flung islands, the U.S. desired a canal through Central America in order to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. However, building a canal would be difficult. The French had already failed to complete a canal through the tropic jungles, and before the U.S. could even try, it needed to negotiate an agreement with the British to cancel an earlier treaty of 1850, in which any canal in Central America was to be under joint U.S.-British control. This agreement, called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, was signed in 1901. With the British agreement to let U.S. build a canal alone, Roosevelt took charge. So Roosevelt orchestrated a revolt for Panama's independence from Colombia in 1903, and then Panama signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty of 1903 to grant the U.S. all rights to the Canal Zone. Kind of sketchy. So it took about 10 years to build. Hundreds of laborers died. Latin Americans didn't like Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, can you believe it? And then ultimately in 1999, we returned the Canal Zone to the Republic of Panama to end growing bitterness. Then we added the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the U.S. would intervene in Latin American countries that struggled economically with European debts. Basically, we didn't want Europeans handling it because we saw it as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and the long-term effect was poor U.S. relations with Latin America. Now, Taft, his focus in Latin America was known as dollar diplomacy, supporting American enterprises abroad while promoting U.S. trade. In China, he worked to invest in railroads, and in Nicaragua, he intervened in financial affairs and sent the Marines to help with the Civil War. And then as for Wilson, his policy was known as the moral diplomacy. He wanted to demonstrate that the U.S. respected other nations' rights and would support the spread of democracy. The Philippines, they got territorial status and were promised independence when they were stable. Puerto Rico granted U.S. citizenship to all inhabitants in 1917. And then the Panama Canal, the U.S. had been exempt from paying tolls, but then Wilson said they'd pay the tolls. So that's a wrap up on American imperialism during this time period. Obviously, it's going to keep continuing past World War I.